Good afternoon to all our members across the country, and especially those, good morning, who are on the West Coast. I'm Lucy Collin, Vice President of Member Experiences at the CMA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual exclusive experience. Please join me in a virtual applause to our presenting sponsor, CAA, as well as the Gustavson School of Business at the University of Victoria. We really appreciate their support in making this virtual experience happen. We hope you'll engage us on social media during this webinar. Don't forget to tag us at CDN Marketing on social media and use the hashtags CMA Events and CMA at Home. Also feel free to engage our speakers on social media throughout the experience today. In today's exclusive experience, we'll hear from industry experts about Gustavson's Brand Trust Index. We learn about the changes in the consumer trust and brands and see who found themselves in the crosshairs of the pandemic. This keynote will be followed by a panel discussion with 3 of the top marketing executives in Canada. Now, this virtual experience will also be made available as a recording and sent to everyone in the post-event email. If you have any questions throughout the session, they will be addressed at the very end of the email. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout and by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. All right, let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Saul Klein from the Gustavson School of Business.
Thanks, Lucy, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to CMA for hosting this event for us to talk about the Brand Trust Index that we've just released a couple of days ago. So the Gustavson School of Business has a real focus on issues of responsible leadership, and we think it's important to help brands understand what is driving consumer interest, particularly when looked at through the lens of trust. We started doing this work about 6 years ago when we became concerned about the erosion of trust more broadly in our society. And for us, looking at how businesses perform through a trust lens allows us to bridge that gap between what businesses are doing for their own interest, narrowly defined, and what more broadly defined consumers are expecting from them. And it's based on those things that we came up with the Gustavson Brand Trust Index, which I'll talk to you about today. As far as the agenda goes, I'll give you a little bit of a retrospect where we've come from over the last few years, then talk about our results from 2020. And interestingly, we'll have results from both the beginning of 2020 and from a limited follow-up study that we did in the wake of the pandemic hitting us all. Talk about Canada's most trusted brands, our methodology, some stories from the field that I think you'll find interesting, and then open up with a panel discussion, as Lucy mentioned, with some of Canada's foremost marketers.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so if we think about where we've come from, we started the study with a pilot in 2015, but beginning in 2016, we've stabilized our methodology and gradually been increasing the number of brands that we've been looking at. Back in 2016, we started with a focus on trying to explain why values-based trust is becoming important. As businesses are differentiating themselves from their competitors, we argue that it is no longer sufficient to just look at purely functional bases for trust or even relationship ones, but that values start to matter. And I'll come back to that towards the end of this discussion today. In 2017, when we looked at the data, we found it was very clear that consumers were placing more value on relationship trust with service-based brands and more value on functional trust with product-based brands. And again, I'll talk about what relationship trust and functional trust mean to us. 2018, in the wake of a lot of media stories about truth and news, fake news, we started to see a very significant gap emerging between social media and more traditional media in terms of how they're trusted. 2019, we started to look at failure recovery. We looked at brands that had stumbled and tried to understand what was helping them recover and rebuild their trust with Canadians, as opposed to leaving them lagging behind. In that year, for example, we took a bit of a deep dive and looked very specifically at 2 brands that had seen a significant erosion of trust. One had been able to recover and the other hadn't. And when we looked at them, it really came down to 2 factors. One is, was the erosion of trust intentional? So was there a deliberate activity that was behind it? And how well did the brand take responsibility and ownership towards rectifying that? So the brand that we think did a really good job of recovering was Samsung. Samsung took a major drop and then recovered quite well, not back to where it was before. And one of the insights from the study is it takes a lot longer to recover lost trust than it is to build it from the beginning. And trust falls faster than it rises. But Samsung had taken a big hit in the wake of their phones, particularly the Galaxy phones, exploding. And if you remember back to those years, it was hard to get on a plane without hearing a message that if you have a Galaxy or a Samsung phone, please make sure it's turned off, or please notify the crew. Now, we saw Samsung recover quite strongly, and we think it was really based on the intentionality behind it. I don't think anybody would argue that Samsung was deliberately trying to make exploding phones. That's not a particularly desirable product feature. So people were much more forgiving, and Samsung has recovered particularly well. Bring us to 2020, when we were in our initial data set back from January and February, we saw that consumer trust in brands had actually been continuing to drop and was the lowest that we'd seen over the last 6 years. And for us, that's both a disturbing trend and one that we need to think about changing. In April of this year, our world obviously had changed again, very dramatically. And we thought that it was worthwhile to go back and look at what had the impact of the pandemic been on a subset of brands, trying to gauge the changes in consumer trust. So that's where we've come from over the last 6 years. For 2020, we identify the top brands overall, and then we identify the brands that we categorize based on the industry segment, and we have 28 categories of brands. In total, we measured 342 national brands in Canada. This is a national study, and we only include brands that actually operate beyond a particular region that have a national footprint. And then, as you can see from the different categories, we identify who is the leading brand in terms of trust. There's been a lot of consistency in many of those brands. So what you see, coffee and tea, Kicking Horse, for example, has regularly been in the top spot. Lindt in the confectionery and snack bracket, food and drug retailers, Costco. We see a lot of consistency. If we look at other categories, we see Fairmont routinely leading in hotels, CAA in insurance, CBC in media, MEC as a specialty retailer. And then this year, we added a new category of toys and games for the first time, where Lego came out quite strongly. So that's a little bit of the results. How we get to them is really through a large consumer survey. The 2020 data included almost 8,000 Canadians. We did a follow-up study on a limited set of brands with 1,000 consumers. All of the data collected by online questionnaires, respondents rate multiple brands, and before they were asked questions about those brands, we screen for familiarity. So we only ask consumers who are familiar with the brand what they think about them. When we're looking at our measures, we really are measuring and examining net scores, which is the difference between the proportion of respondents who trust versus those who distrust individual brands. Essentially a net promoter kind of score. While the index is scored theoretically from -100 to +100, most of the brands tend to, or the spread of brand trust tends to be from about -30 to +60, some brands into the high 60s. So that's what we've been doing and how we've been doing it. Our 2020 most trusted brands are on the screen now. MEC and CAA tying for first place. The little arrows and the numbers next to them show the change from last year. And you'll see there's quite a lot of consistency. The top 3 brands, bringing in Costco as well, have been in the top 3 consistently every year we've done the study with that includes them. The other thing you'll see, it's a bit harder to read, but the numbers underneath the brand name show that the trust, the trust score as opposed to the ranking. And you'll see for most of the brands, even in the top 10, while they're very highly trusted brands in Canada, we have seen a small decline over the last year, which has exacerbated the overall phenomenon of trust being at the lowest level this year than it's been in the last 5. We introduced some new brands each year, Dyson, for example, which came in very strongly, and Lego, which you see as tied for 9th place. You also see a preponderance of retail brands at the top, as well as if we look at the top 3, the interesting characteristic is they're all membership-based brands. And we think there's something around those brands that reinforces their connection with their customers, also highlights the amount of information they have on their customers, which allows them to tailor and build strong brand relationships. We measure trust in terms of an overall perception, whether the brand is trustworthy and acts with integrity, and that's the core basis on which we rank the brands. We then look at 3 attributes or 3 types of trust that we think contribute, and the data supports that, contribute to overall brand trust. One is a very functional basis, dealing with consumer perceptions and how well the brand performs or delivers on its core promises, value for money, quality, reliability, that kind of thing. We also look at relationship trust, consumer perceptions of how the brand interacts with its customers. Does the brand treat us well as customers when we have a problem? Do they communicate honestly with us? Do they protect our privacy, for example? And then the third characteristic, which is the one, certainly at the Gustavson School, that we are following most closely, and we think it's part of that broader evolution that's taking place in the market, is values-based trust. That consumers are not only choosing brands based on the functionality that they deliver, or even the relationships based on the service, but that they're also buying the value system. And consumers are increasingly looking to spend their cash with brands whose values align with their own. And we're talking here about things like how well the brand respects and protects the environment. Does the brand treat employees well? Does the brand play a more positive role in society? And then we also measure word of mouth, which, since we're not actually measuring purchase behavior, we're measuring the extent to which consumers recommend the brand to others. And we tie those constructs together in a model that looks something like this, where brand trust in the middle is the key measure based on whether it's perceived to be trustworthy and acting with integrity. We measure the value-based, functional, and relationship trust separately and look at the relationship between them. And then brand trust is an indicator of word of mouth. I should indicate that the correlations between these constructs is incredibly high, well over 0.9. And then on the right hand, we're not measuring this directly, but we've done some other work that suggests that brand trust is also a leading indicator of revenue growth. As we would expect, we will do more business, consumers will do more business with brands they trust. So that's kind of where we come from in terms of the model. From the data in 2020, we see some examples of brands that have gained trust. We see others that have lost trust. In general, reinforcing the point that trust is easier to lose than it is to gain. Those brands that have lost trust have lost more than those brands that have gained trust. And we'll talk about some of those brands as we go forward. Let me kind of bring you into the discussion right now. So in March, when the pandemic hit, we started worrying about, or wondering whether brands would be perceived differently in the world. And we identified some brands that we thought might be affected by the pandemic. And I'd like to put a poll to you to ask your opinions. If you could just respond online. We're asking you for each of 6 brands. Do you think the brand gained or lost trust during the pandemic? And then we'll talk about the results as I go through the presentation. So, beginning with Amazon, do you think they gained or lost trust? And this is essentially between January or February of this year and late April. Similarly for Lysol, then Google, and Then we go into the other three brands. If you just scroll down on that, Loblaws, Visa, and Canada Post. So all quite familiar brands. So if you would just respond, be interesting to see what your prior assumptions were, and I'll talk about what ours are. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to complete that. The poll should be live on your screen. I do see the question coming in from somebody who's having trouble. If you're calling in, obviously you're not being able to see the graphics. You wouldn't see the poll. Okay, I see there are a couple of people having problems with the poll. Okay, in that case, maybe we just cut it short. I'm not sure what the technical problem is. Are there any results that came through on the poll? Okay, so we do see that for many of you, we're able to respond. Results that we got, and apologies for those of you who couldn't respond, fairly equal in terms of response on Amazon, whether you think they gained or lost trust. In terms of Lysol, most people think they gained trust. Google, similarly, gained trust. Loblaws, most people think gained trust. Same for Visa, same for Canada Post. Interestingly, our data support some of those findings, but not all, and I'll maybe talk a little bit about those now. Amazon in particular has been a really interesting brand for us to look at. Between 2019 and 2020, we saw significant erosion in trust in Amazon, losing 17 points overall. That's not the ranking, that's in the measure of brand trust. So, based on that, on the scale we developed. We found that it fell further during the pandemic by another 7 points, which surprised us. Our prior going into this was that Amazon would probably do well during the pandemic, seeing a lot more usage as it became more difficult to purchase products in the retail environment. We thought that Amazon, by delivering, would be able to gain trust. Instead, we found that trust fell, and we think there's really three factors behind that. One, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, there were a number of products in very short supply, and some of the products that were available increased dramatically in price. Now, this was often due to third parties, vendors on Amazon sites, but concern about price gouging probably had an impact as well. Second, because of the increased volume, Amazon has had to limit and in some cases defer delivery of certain products. Again, shortage is part of that as well. And then the third one, which is one of the things we were really looking closely at during the pandemic, was how people perceive the company as dealing or treating employees. And there were a number of concerns raised from within Amazon employees about working conditions, whether it was additional stress from increased activity, but also whether Amazon was taking sufficient steps to protect workers in their facilities. Now, we're not evaluating whether those perceptions are accurate or not. We're just identifying them as perceptions that probably had an impact on how consumers perceived and the trust they had in Amazon. Lysol, most of you thought that Lysol would have increased in trust. We expected that as well. Same for Clorox. It turns out that for both of those brands, Canadians' trust actually declined a little bit. And we attribute that finding to the availability of the products. So enormous demand for cleaning products, particularly Clorox and Lysol. The products became hard to find. And at a broad level, we'd argue that it's hard to trust a brand when it's not available when you need it. So it does, again, reinforce the concerns with managing supply chains and be able to respond rapidly to both increased demand and the disruption in supply chains that happened during the pandemic. Google, again, very interesting. We've been following Google together with Facebook, Amazon, as well as Netflix as the FANG brands. And overall, they've been declining in our major study. Google's trust ranking in 2019 fell dramatically from number 39 to 230 among the 342 brands in our study. If you look at the graph on the right, it shows the scores as opposed to the ranking. And you'll see that the fall in Google's brand trust score overall, and then the different components similarly falling. Brand trust is overall trust, FT is functional trust, in red, in yellow, relationship trust, and then in black or navy blue, the value-based trust. You'll also see a rebound in April, which is really the pandemic effect. And we saw a very sharp jump in Google's brand trust score in the wake of the pandemic. Now, certainly that raises the question of whether Google's recovery will be sustained, but it's similar to what we saw in many media brands, where during the pandemic, the consumer's appetite for information and consumption of information increased dramatically, and certainly increased focus or increased reliance on Google paid off with respect to trust. One of the other findings that we were really interested in looking at was how employee treatment would be seen. In the early days of the pandemic, lots of concern about what was happening to employees. Were companies laying off their staff? Were they treating people well as they made this transition? So we were asked directly about employee treatment as well as the overall brand trust, and we saw a very strong effect, particularly in food and drug stores, Loblaws, Real Canadian Superstores, Walmart. Their scores on employee treatment jumped quite strongly, and similarly, so did their overall brand trust. On the other hand, brands like Uber, Skip the Dishes, Lyft, and Amazon were found wanting in this kind of environment. The interesting question now, and certainly those of you who've been following the news will be asking, well, what happens to those trust in those brands who treated their employees well during the pandemic, but have now started to retract or reverse some of the short-term price or short-term wage supplements that were given. So many of the retailers added $2 to an hourly wage for frontline service staff. Those are starting to come off, and there is certainly a reaction likely about those. Asked about Visa, interestingly, we found that financial service brands were generally weakened by the pandemic. For the main study, we also found that the banks were exhibiting an interesting characteristic, that for most products and most brands, there's a very high correlation between brand trust and word of mouth. For banks, however, we found that that's breaking down a little bit. That brand trust is reasonably high, but word of mouth tends to be low. So obviously it's suggesting that there are other factors coming in for banks that we're not picking up in the trust measures directly. In the follow-up survey, we saw that credit cards in particular lost trust, payment processes generally. So in addition to Visa, MasterCard, and American Express, we also saw PayPal dropping in trust. On the big surprise side, we thought there'd be an increase. We're surprised at how strong it was, that Canada Post saw a very pronounced increase in brand trust after the pandemic hit, although that's part of a general trend that we've been seeing for the last 5 years, where brand trust in Canada Post has been increasing fairly consistently. Admittedly, back in 2016, was coming off a fairly low level, but certainly in the post-pandemic follow-up study, the high trust is probably attributable to both doing an excellent job of keeping staff and customers safe, while continuing to provide what is increasingly seen as an essential service. Those are the stories that come out of the pandemic one in particular. There are a couple of other ones I'll just mention quickly. One of the things we're seeing when we look at different demographics, we're very much seeing that millennials, while overall as an age category, trust less, they're more jaded, more cynical. When they do trust brands, they're looking for brands who deliver on a greater sense of purpose, that are making a broader difference in society. So for those aged 18 to 35, Lush was recognized as the most trusted brand in Canada. Again, not only overall, but also on functional and relational bases, not just on the value-based one. So that's kind of an interesting finding if we think about where the market is going in the future. So we see that factor in terms of millennial behavior. We also are interested in what's happening in the sharing economy. As we're seeing sharing economy types of brands, Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, we're watching carefully what's happening there. We would expect those brands to be even more dependent on trust. Airbnb, however, is really struggling. In 2020, we saw them reach a new low in its overall trust score with a negative values-based trust score. So in terms of the values that consumers are looking for, they see Airbnb in particular playing a negative role. More people distrust them than trust them. A new entrant this year was Dyson. Certainly came out very strongly as the most trusted product-based brand in Canada. Clearly built a brand that's trustworthy and high in functionality. Hotels as a category we were interested in both pre and post the pandemic. Back in 2018, hotels category was the highest ranking category at all on brand trust, and for the third consecutive year. We thought that made sense, that hotels very much have to compete on the basis of all three values or all three elements of trust, on functional, service related, as well as value related elements. But in 2019 and 2020, we saw the trust in hotels generally start to decline. And particularly after the pandemic hit, trust in hotels fell. That wasn't a massive surprise. I think all of us are thinking hard about whether we're going to resume our travel and at what point we resume our travel and how comfortable we are in going back to hotels. And obviously Fairmont, as a consequence, dropped out of our top 10 brand ranking. So just in summary, consistency and quality and innovation is critical. Those organizations that deliver consistently high product and service quality engender greater consumer trust and loyalty. Innovation contributes to trust, but not if it comes at the expense of other values. For an organization to be trusted and seen as credible, it has to be available. So reliability in supply chain matters. Organizations that demonstrate concern with employees' well-being and empathize with employees and their experiences build or regain trust. Even as shoppers find themselves using a brand more, does not necessarily mean that they trust it. And that has big implications for recovery after the pandemic. And then finally, again, the issue about millennials and General Z, how they build trust, or how brands build trust by playing a positive role in society, speaking to the environmental and social aspects that young people in particular care about. So that's my take on what we've seen. Let me now introduce our panelists. We have three amazing panelists to talk about their experiences. I'll introduce them briefly now, then show you a little bit about how their brands are doing. Then we'll open up a broader discussion with the panelists, following which I'll invite you to provide questions and we'll open it up to a broader Q&A. From left to right on the screen, in alphabetical order, we have Tom Newitt. Tom is Vice President Marketing at A&W. He joined A&W in 2012 as it began a new strategy, and Tom has led the marketing and communications team in repositioning the brand. successfully, I might add, as the leader in great tasting natural food for burger lovers in Canada. Before joining A&W, Tom was Director of Brand Management and Research at Nature's Path Organic Foods. In the middle, Sandra Sanderson, the Senior Vice President Marketing at Sobeys Inc. Sandra oversees marketing across a broad portfolio of banners, including Sobeys, Safeway, Freshco, Thrifty Foods, Foodland, and Lawton's. She began her career at Procter & Gamble and has held senior marketing roles at Kraft, Coca-Cola, Canada Post, and Universal Studios. She was also Senior Vice President of Marketing at Shoppers Drug Mart and Chief Marketing and Quality Officer at Walmart Canada. Prior to joining Sobeys, Sandra was Senior Vice President of Marketing at White House Black Market, based in Fort Myers, Florida. And then third, certainly no stranger to our launch panels, Jeff Walker, who's President and CEO for CAA North and East Ontario. Jeff joined CAA in 2009 as Vice President Public Affairs and Chief Strategy Officer. At CAA, he's responsible for leading the National Officers Rewards Program, travel, and public affairs efforts, as well as being actively involved in market research, communications, and branding. So welcome to all three of you. Before I turn it over to you, let me just give the audience a glimpse of how your brands have done in our study. Starting with Sobeys, very strong performance. Sobeys ranked number 23 in the overall brand trust rankings in 2020. Again, the graph on the right shows the scores, not the rankings. So you see those scores, they're really high numbers. Sobeys received the 8th highest values-based trust score, and on relationship trust placed number 13 in 2020. CAA is the most trusted brand in Canada. Now, we didn't include CAA in the post-pandemic survey because we didn't think it would have as much impact on them. But since being added to the list of brands in 2017, CAA has been the number 1 or the number 2 brand every year, and has certainly received the highest relationship trust score for 4 consecutive years. And thirdly, A&W is a category leader for the 3rd consecutive year in the takeout restaurant category. They have a particular strength in Western Canada, and amongst all of our brands, consumers in BC and Alberta placed A&W 3rd overall, tied with Mec and Bose on overall brand trust. So 3 really interesting companies with very strong brand positions, 3 panelists with amazing backgrounds and experience. So let me stop sharing my screen and we'll open it up, let you see the panelists and begin to have a conversation with the panelists. Okay, as they're coming on board, let me start in turn with each of you, maybe just in the order that I introduced you. Starting with Tom, I would argue that now more than ever, building consumer trust is vital. What are the ways you're working at A&W to build trust with your consumers?
Hi, Saul. Hi, everybody. Yeah, at A&W, we certainly have made trust a priority. We've made it part of our everyday business. In fact, we have what we call climate goals at A&W, which is a set of behaviors that we live by. It's not just about the climate as in the environment, it's the climate and the relationships that we have with each other. And for trust, we say we will earn the trust of our guests. And I think that's that concept of earning trust. It's not a quick thing. As you said, Saul, you can lose it very quickly, but we focus every day on earning the trust. So you'll see it from, whether it's from the board of directors and the CEO through to people that are cooking your burgers, serving at the drive-through. We all have this climate goal that we live by every day and thinking about how can we earn the trust. And I think that's made a big difference to us in recent years at A&W.
Great. Let me turn to you, Sandra. The same question. Now, you're managing trust across a portfolio of brands. Is there a commonality, or do you look at trust the same way for all of them?
Okay, so I think for all of the banners within Sobeys Inc., we look at building those 3 banners or three pillars of brand trust that you spoke about earlier. Building that functional trust by delivering on the core promises to our customers. In our case, across all banners, it's product assortment, product availability, and value for the money. Building relationship trust through the way that we market to our customers and the ways that we serve them in our stores, and also values-based trust, doing our part for a better planet, better communities, and better products. But I will say, with the pandemic, there were clearly some elements which have risen in importance in building trust with customers. And one of them is safety. When the pandemic began, our very first priority was to keep our teammates and our customers safe in our stores. We wanted customers to trust that we were creating a safe shopping environment for them, because we know how much it matters. And so across every level of the company, across every function, we kicked into high gear. We implemented cleaning and sanitization measures. We were the first grocer to install plexiglass shields at cash. And that built trust because everyone felt just a little bit safer. And in marketing, we established a dedicated COVID task force so that we could ramp up our communications to customers. And we also decided to launch a COVID site where we reported confirmed cases in our business because we wanted to be completely transparent with customers. So overall, I think the strong values of the company really shone through and helped us to build trust across all banners with customers.
Great, and interesting how you're identifying the pandemic effects too, which we'll come back to. Jeff, what about you? How does CAA look at the whole question of trust, and what do you do to stay number one as the most trusted brand in Canada?
Well, it is truly, it's a little bit like what Tom said. For us, it's a constant process of continuous improvement. So, we know we do extremely well in our roadside assistance part of our business in terms of fulfilling the obligations that members count on us for. And we know that, and that's our base, and we work hard at that, but we work really, really hard at doing better in all the other little things that we do. I'll give you one COVID example. So during COVID, obviously the number of members that needed us at the roadside fell, but we were still an emergency service. And so we had all these staff and trucks around. And so a bunch of our clubs got ourselves organized to do grocery delivery to members who might need it in their homes and where they were at home because they were quarantined, etc. So we just, within a week or so, swung into action and had a bunch of our drivers turn into grocery delivery folks for a while. And we're still doing it now, even for a number of our members through this time. So it truly is a continuous improvement exercise, and recognizing that even if you're doing well in one area, you really can't slow down in the others.
Mm-hmm. So if you think about that specific linkage, I mean, we're collecting individual feedback from consumers and they're looking for tangible improvements. How do you bridge that gap? How do you ensure that you're taking the feedback from consumers and really acting on it in a powerful and direct way? Jeff?
Yeah, well, for us, there's a couple of different ways. There's the informal way where we hear member feedback through social media and other channels. But one of the things we did was we partnered with a company called Medallia a couple of years ago, and they are now our customer satisfaction platform. And a couple of really important things we've done in the Medallia piece. Number one is that we survey every single member that interacts with us, no matter what channel, within the next day. We send them a survey, we get the feedback. And if they give us a score of anywhere between 0 to 6 out of 10, we have feedback loops. So we have staff in our call centers that call them back and ask them about what happened and how can we make it better and how can we ensure that we do better the next time. So we have really, really tight feedback loops. And what's really interesting for us is that I think historically we've thought about surveys as a thing that maybe it'll annoy a person and they'll just be irritated by getting a. What we've learned is if you do it right and you ask just 5, 6 questions, they answer it in 2 minutes, it actually engenders trust by the fact that you sent them a survey. So it actually works the opposite to what some conventional understandings about how surveys work. So we've learned that. The Medallia piece has been fantastic for us in all parts of our business. One thing we've learned is that our drivers at the roadside, they're great. They've always been great, but where can we really do better? It's at managing expectations of how fast we get to people. Even if we get it, if people are 1 minute late to get to a member, we might not get a 10 out of 10, and then everybody's upset. So we're working really, really hard to manage expectations on the call center, because that's one of the feedback pieces we've learned.
Interesting. Jeff, let me just give you one more follow-up, and then we'll move to the other panelists. You have a lot of data on your customers because they're your members, and
Yep.
in some ways that gives you an advantage. Is it also a concern about privacy, or how do you balance that, on the one hand, need to tailor your messaging, tailor your offerings to individual customers based on your understanding of them at an individual level,
Yep.
and not creeping them up by having them think that you know too much about them?
Well, it's a fine line to walk, to tell you the truth, Saul. You know, we have a dedicated group of people who are the, you know, sort of the, I guess the architects of management of communications, for example, that really tell us internally, tell me, I'm the, you know, CEO here, and they're like, Jeff, we're emailing too often, or whatever we're doing. And I'm like, okay, let's make sure we get this right. But by and large, it is a learning by doing exercise. And by and large, our members are happy. So for example, if a member has forgotten to renew their travel insurance with us, and they call us up for a roadside event, and we say, you know, we noticed that, you know, your travel insurance annual plan expired a couple months ago. 9 times out of 10, they're happy to be reminded, and they just say, oh yeah, we don't need it anymore, or yeah, we need to renew. So as long as you always work to meet the test of, is it serving the member's needs? And that's the test we try and apply every day in the way we communicate and use that information we have.
Interesting. Sandra, let me turn a similar question to you. As I indicated at the outset, member-based brands, I think, have an advantage because they have a defined, identifiable customer base. You're dealing with customers across an incredibly broad range of demographics, a very broad market. How do you make sure that you're responding to the right signals from those customers?
Well, similar to Jeff, we are constantly listening to customers. We do have a customer experience survey where we get hundreds of thousands of customers that respond back after their shopping experience. We do consumer research, social listening, and a lot of that translates into new opportunities to improve. You know, but there is one thing that I really noticed when I joined Sobeys that stands out. And that is the fact that we have a culture that really encourages teammates to speak up and to bring new ideas to the table. Our store teams are super connected to the needs of their local communities. And sometimes ideas that are sparked from a conversation with a customer can end up being rolled out across our banners. And, you know, one example of that is we had a store manager in PEI who had a conversation with a customer, which brought to light the unique challenges that people with sensory sensitivities face when they shop for groceries. You know, the bright lights, the sounds can be painful and can sometimes even be overwhelming. So the store team in PEI rose to the challenge. They worked with Autism PEI to create this sensory-friendly shopping hour. You know, we dimmed the lights in our stores, we turned off the music, PA announcements, we reduced cash register sounds to help make that experience just better for those customers and their families who've been struggling with doing something that we all just, you know, take for granted, going grocery shopping. And the feedback from the community was extraordinary. In fact, the store teams received handwritten letters from the schools and the families expressing their gratitude. Parents were so happy that they could now shop with their kids who have these sensitivities. And given the positive response, we quickly rolled out the idea across more stores. And we ended up being the first retailer to offer sensory-friendly shopping nationally across our network of banners. So in this case, listening to feedback from that one customer helped us to build trust across our entire store network.
Interesting. So it's both sensing and responding to those customers very quickly. Tom, how does that work at A&W?
Well, I would agree with Jeff and Sandra. You've got so much data and information and feedback coming in all of the time. So I think you've got to get yourselves very good at listening to it, and then deciding what you're going to act on, and then measuring as well, seeing whether you did do it. I think one thing that is a bit different at A&W we do is, if you call or email or give feedback about a specific restaurant, you'll get a call or an email or back from the restaurant owner or manager. So we do make it quite a personal experience. We really want to hear what that guest has to say. One example of a change that we've made based on guest feedback and our own kind of conviction is actually to washrooms and washrooms in the restaurants. We recognize that a cleaner washroom really does engender trust, and it's what we all want to start with. But if you have a really clean restroom or washroom in a restaurant, then it shows that you've got a very high attention to detail, and you're likely to be doing other things really well as well. That your operating standards are likely to be very high. We put a big focus on washrooms, and it really worked. And so we do measure how clean our washrooms are compared to other restaurant brands, and we've got a clear lead in that. So guests have noticed, they gave us the feedback, and now we're closing that loop and saying yes, it's made a difference to. I think it's probably made a difference to our trust scores that we're talking about.
Interesting example, focusing on the things that are most visible that consumers can evaluate. While, you know, cleanliness of washrooms is probably a good thing in its own right, for a restaurant, it probably also sends a strong signal about how clean your kitchens are, which is what we ultimately care even more about, but can't assess.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's hard to have this discussion without getting into the current environment and post-COVID. Tom, let me begin with you. I mean, restaurants have taken probably the biggest hit in the current environment, and we continue to see a lot of resistance. How do you see A&W recovering from the pandemic, or more broadly, what do you see happening in the restaurant and takeout market as a whole?
That's the big question. It's one we're all asking ourselves. I'm not sure anybody knows the answer. I'll share my perspective. I think one thing you said is right. We have the restaurant industry has a big responsibility in terms of safety and public trust. So, and I do see all the restaurant industry taking that seriously and changing very quickly, evolving very quickly. I think in terms of what will happen is consumers now have a totally new set of needs that they didn't really have before, pre-COVID, specifically for restaurants in terms of cleanliness and safety and social distancing. And I do see that the restaurant industry has responded very quickly. A&W certainly has in terms of doing that. The other clear evolution that's happened and taken a big jump forward is digital ordering methods. So particularly the delivery industry and mobile apps and contactless ordering methods. And those have taken a big jump. I think it's quite well known. I think those are here to stay now. So a lot of people have tried those, like them, and will continue doing so. The unknown, I think, in the industry is the role that price will have in terms of trust and the impact as brands continue to come back, and the economy starts to take a bit of an impact. I think that's one of the big unknowns for the restaurant industry is the impact of price.
Well, price would also be related to the actions that you need to take. And I would think your financial model under strain, that social distancing is going to limit the amount of people who are actually in the restaurant.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. Sandra, pandemic for you, I mean, this is interesting. We've seen supermarkets in particular be seen as an essential service, and in ways that I don't think they were seen as before. We've come to recognize, obviously, how important it is that we get our groceries, but we have I think a different view of supermarkets than we did before. How do you see that evolving into the future, and what changes are you making as a consequence?
You're right. We never really saw ourselves as an essential service, but we recognize that feeding Canadians is something that we are accountable to do. And one of the things that's happened is the pandemic has driven a big shift to online grocery. Canada, as you know, has been lagging behind other markets in this space, and now sales have almost tripled. So that's why we're super excited to be soon launching Voila by Sobeys, which is our new online grocery platform. We'll be starting in the GTA for those who live in the GTA. We are Ocado's exclusive Canadian partner. And so we will be delivering from an automated warehouse where robots actually assemble the orders. I've been there, and it's It's cool. And Voila teammates will safely deliver them to our customers' homes with minimal handling, which I think is very relevant for today and what customers are looking for. And of course, we know that customers who shop both in-store and online are twice as loyal. They spend more. So we believe that the Voila proposition will enhance our bricks and mortar offering. And it's something that will be very right for our customers given COVID.
Interesting. Are there changes that you think are in the works for your industry? Do you think this is going to continue a shakeout, and brands that don't have scale are going to be under a lot more pressure?
Well, I think there's always a need for differentiation, right? Brands need to differentiate and stand for something. We certainly know with the pandemic that many customers will be facing financial challenges. I read somewhere that I think 40% of the Canadian workforce has been impacted by COVID in some way. So we certainly see that delivering value will be important. Fortunately for us, that we were already starting to roll out our FreshCo discount banners in the West, and we think that's going to continue to be relevant to customers. I think those stores that have something unique, that's differentiated, specialty, will be important. And I think more consumers will be wanting to shop local as well. I think people are feeling quite patriotic right now, and everybody wants to support their local restaurants. They want to support their local stores.
Yeah, and if anything, I think you're right that the pandemic has reinforced or highlighted the role that companies and brands play in solving customer problems, but also employees and more societal ones with increasing expectations. Jeff, from a CAA perspective, the question that I think many brands have been thinking about, I'm wondering how your leadership team looked at it, is what do you want to be, did you even think about the question, what do you want to be remembered for doing during this time? Because in times of stress, consumers are often going to build preferences that'll have long-lasting effects because there's a deeper emotional connection to brand.
What I can tell you, what we care about is that we help bridge this time for our members. I'll give you two quick examples. So one is that, obviously, lots of our members renew every month. And so we put in a policy that for our members, if they were having a difficult time and they couldn't necessarily cover even the $100 or so it was to renew their membership, that we would bridge them for a couple of months and we just have them covered, and then we'll call them back in June or July or August. And I can't tell you what kind of feedback that's been great, and we will continue to do that on an as needed basis. The other thing that we've done is you introduce new products, and Sandra alluded to it in terms of brands, but we introduced a product about a year ago called CAA MyPace. What is CAA MyPace? It's a product that you pay as you go for your car insurance. Okay, so in BC, where I know you live, Saul, you wouldn't know this because you got ICBC, but in the rest of Canada, you have to pay, it's a private sector thing. Well, we introduced to pay as you go. So you pay in 500-kilometer blocks, and that's all you pay. So you don't pay necessarily this flat rate that everybody of your demographic pays. Well, that works pretty well when nobody's driving, right? Or if you're a two-car household and maybe one of the people's not going to work every day, that product's sitting there waiting, and we've been promoting it like crazy. We know we make less money on it, right? But we also know it's a great way for our members to have a meaningful economic benefit that's associated with this disruption. So those are two examples of the kinds of things that we're doing, and different people in our clubs dream up new ideas to constantly think about what we can do to make things better.
Great. I was just thinking as you were saying, that new program would work really well for me. Can we roll it out in BC? My average commute is about 3 kilometers, so it would make a big difference.
You need to call the government of BC people, but we'd be right there if they open it up.
Thank you. Tom, what about you? Did you think about, what do we want to be remembered for coming out of this pandemic?
We actually use those very words as a leadership team, and I think a lot of businesses do that, but we immediately set up a daily morning meeting, and we've had, that leadership team's now had 100 or closing in on 100 meetings, and that's been invaluable. Just in terms of what do we want to be remembered for, it's so important for us to communicate internally as much as possible. So it's brought that team together, and then it enables you to make decisions together as well. So an example at A&W in terms of wanting to be able to help and make a difference in communities is just, and it was a relatively simple thing, but truck drivers were having a big problem feeding themselves, stopping for a break, having a coffee across the country, and they weren't having the usual restaurants or hotels or pit stops open. So we allowed walkthroughs and made a special efforts to tell truck drivers, hey, you're very welcome at A&W, you can walk through, park up, come by, and that made a big difference. And it was just a question that wouldn't normally go to the leadership team in terms of what do we want to be remembered for, but it was those kind of little things that we suddenly found ourselves making lots of decisions on.
So, Sandra, was that a question that your leadership team addressed directly as well?
Yes, I think I mentioned earlier that the idea of being an essential service to Canadians made us think differently about our role within Canada. And so we were very much focused on keeping our shelves stocked, which was not so easy in the beginning, but we kept at it, and keeping our customers and our teammates safe. We also focused on helping our communities. Within 10 days of the COVID shutdown, we created a community action fund to help address the immediate emergency needs of our communities. We decided, instead of providing a lump sum donation to a national charity, which quite frankly would have been far easier to administrate, we decided to take a different approach. And that is to put the funds into the hands of our individual store operators who really know their communities the best. And so what this did was it empowered each store to make a difference in their community, which made them proud. And across our network of 1,500 stores, we injected millions of dollars into local communities where it was needed the most. And then we shared those stories through social media for our customers, and we created a hub to showcase the donations made by each store. Now that was at the beginning of COVID. We're now many, many weeks into the pandemic, and we recognize that customers are adjusting to a new normal, but everyone's getting a little bit of pandemic fatigue. I don't know about you guys, but I am. So people want to get out, right? They want to connect with others, they want to enjoy life, but they want to be able to do it safely. So this past weekend, we decided to bring our focus on safety and our focus on community together. And we decided to partner our Safeway banner in the West with Brett Kissel, who's an Edmonton country singer, to host Canada's first ever drive-in country music concert. And we had 100% of the ticket sales go to support the 95 food banks across Alberta. And for us, one of the key pillars of our Safeway brand is to be Western Canada proud. So from a marketing perspective, the event was very, very brand right. And there was 8 shows, 36 hours long in total. And then we had 2 shows dedicated to frontline workers and their families. So this event was a huge success because it gave our customers a chance to enjoy live music in their community. It helped the food banks with social distancing, and it brought together those 2 areas that we would like to be remembered for during this pandemic, keeping our customers safe and supporting our community. And it was a lot of fun.
Really interesting. Certainly, pandemic fatigue is something we can all relate to, right up there with Zoom fatigue. You're referring to a whole bunch of initiatives, and actually all 3 of you refer to engaging activities that may be seen as, in some ways, as tangential to your core business. They're supporting communities, but they're not necessarily driving revenue. How do you balance the expectations to be, maybe less of an issue for Jeff, but how do you balance the need to be socially responsible in your activities, but also to deliver value to shareholders? Sandra, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Overall, so I don't know if I see it as being mutually exclusive. It's not like it's one or the other. Often they go hand in hand. A good example of that is our elimination of single-use plastic bags at Sobeys. That's an example of doing what's right for future generations, and it's good for business. Many of our customers, as well as our own teammates, said to us, you know, we need to use less plastic. And we agreed with that. So in January, our Sobeys stores across the country said goodbye to single-use plastic bags. And we were, in fact, the first national grocer to take this bold step. And, you know, we might have been maybe a little nervous about it, but we knew it was the right thing to do. So this change removed 225 million plastic bags annually from circulation. That's nearly enough plastic bags to wrap around the earth twice. And the feedback from our consumers was extremely positive. And, you know, a lot of people applaud our decision to protect our planet, but it was also good for business.
Great. Sam, how about you? I mean, are you able to avoid similarly, you know, being seen to make a trade-off? And that's something that we as a business school talk about a lot, that we try to avoid having, you know, trying to make the argument that there is no inherent trade-off between doing the right thing and being successful. That doing good and doing well aren't contradictory, but they actually reinforce each other. Do you, I mean, I'm assuming from the way you talked before that you're probably in agreement with that, but how does that factor into your decision-making?
Yeah, totally in agreement with it. In terms of decision-making, I think you've got to get good at knowing what your consumers really value. And so if your values-based trust in this survey is really important, that you know when you're making a difference or a change that your consumers really value, and that's what will deliver maximum value to the brand. There are going to be other things which you're going to decide increasingly just to do anyway, just because it's the right thing to do, and never tell your consumers about it at all, and they'll probably never find out about it. And I think A&W is not alone, but increasingly making those kinds of decisions, because you see yourself having that role in society, and you're employing and working alongside a lot of people that want to do that kind of thing. The other thing I'll add in terms of this is, you mentioned earlier, Saul, in the presentation, the importance of innovation. And I think innovation here has an increasing importance at A&W in terms of being able to do both the values-based, but then also the functional side of trust. So, and if you can get those two things right, it's really important. So if you do a paper straw, it's got to really work. You know, it's got to work as a straw. If you do a plant-based burger, it's got to be a great tasting, delicious plant-based burger. And that's what will deliver maximum value. But, and we found that. So we're always looking for those kinds of opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Jeff, how do you find those opportunities? Again, you don't have the same shareholder pressure, but
no, but
financial performance would be an important indicator of for CAA too.
Well, that's right. And remember, we're in the insurance business, right? So in addition to the travel business and the roadside assistance business, and there are those bottom line considerations, but what I'm betting what Tom and Sandra would say, and I bet many of the people who are senior people that are in this thing would say, is boards of directors psychology around this is changing. It's not the same as it was 20 years ago where, you know, there's a bunch of cigars and what are you doing? Why are you spending? You know, they see what you showed with that Lush thing you showed with the 18 to 34 earlier. They know that we all need to be doing those things. It's a question of how we focus our energy in those areas. That's what I find is with our boards, the main questions are really not whether or not to do it. It's, are you focused? Are you on too many of these kinds of things, or which ones are you on and which ones can you really make a difference on? So I just wanted to say that's a real change that I see at the board level in organizations, my own and others that I'm around, that helps make that ball move a way maybe it didn't even 10 years ago.
You're right, and we've certainly seen that evolution taking place from a shareholder-driven view of capitalism to more of a stakeholder-based view. And similarly with the discussion about purpose, and that our organizations have a larger purpose and obligation to do things. It does raise a question, and this is, I'm picking up one of the questions that's coming on the Q&A line. In many ways, the expectations of business are increasing. And you're being asked to take statements, to take positions on issues that you wouldn't have done in the past. So certainly in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the protests against systemic racism and the Black Lives Matter movement. How do you decide when and when you don't take a position on what could be controversial angles? Tom?
I think it all comes down to where you can make a difference and where you can act. And if you're not ready to make a difference and act, then perhaps you should spend a bit of time thinking about it before you make statements. Is where I think. But if you're a brand that it's something controversial is going on, and you're really in it, and you think, yeah, we've got something that we're doing that's really valuable here that we can add, then I think that's when it's most applicable and most valuable to everybody and to society for us to do that. Okay,
so does taking a stand on controversial issues help or heighten consumer trust in your brands, or does it just result in putting yourselves under further scrutiny and creating increased expectations?
I'll speak.
Okay, sure, Jeff.
We do it. We do it periodically on different kinds of issues. So some people know we're in the travel business, but we've taken a hard stand in terms of expectations, in terms of what airlines and other travel providers are going to provide to Canadians. Because there's this whole discussion about, deferred coupons and things like this. So we've taken a stand that actually isn't in our business interest. Mm-hmm. In that case, it's because that's our business. And so we feel like it's something beyond. But as you get into other areas, we really take just a careful thought of it. Is this us? Is this our thing to say? Or is it something that is really maybe we would do in ourselves in our own public activity? So it's a case-by-case thing. And what we say is, we don't worry about how it affects us in the immediate term. We think about how does it affect our brand over the longer term? And more often than not, we do take a stand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there is also that issue of creating expectations and setting yourselves up. I mean, a good example we saw recently was in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, Starbucks kind of took a misstep. They sent a letter specifically warning staffers against wearing any clothes or messaging in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. At the same time, that followed up on a statement that the CEO had made saying that we will confront racism to create a more inclusive and just world and will not be bystanders. If he hadn't made the statement, there probably wouldn't have been such a strong backlash. Now, Starbucks, to their credit, responded, and they're now producing, I think they've got 250,000 specialty shirts supporting the movement that they're rolling out to their staff. It's easy to get caught wrong-footed. Yeah. Sandra, how do you balance those kinds of issues?
I think that's a great example that you shared, because I think often, all companies make mistakes from time to time. It's how you recover from that. Are you being authentic? In the case of Starbucks, some time ago, they had another issue, and they shut down their stores across the globe to provide training for their teammates, which I think was a very, very compelling thing that they did, and they were, for the most part, forgiven for the mistake that they made. Now, let's see how they come out of this particular one. But I think it's about making sure that you're being truthful, that you're authentic. As you've always mentioned in the past, that it's very hard to gain trust, but it's very easy to lose it. So it's fragile, that relationship with customers.
Yeah, and certainly we are seeing that issue of your values coming through and your actions need to be consistent with your values and what both your employees and your customers are looking for. Let me continue to take questions from the floor. So I'm looking at the Q&A stream. And for the audience, please post additional questions. We have one that picks up the value one, but slightly differently. And what I would suggest in the presentation is that we're seeing consumers be more concerned or paying more attention to how well each of you treats your employees. And that's a factor in their purchase decision. Were you surprised by that, or is that something that's really built into your thinking already? Jeff, do you want to start?
Sure. There's no doubt it's built into our thinking. And I'm sure, I remember Sandra speaking earlier about her frontline people and the way that they interact and that they're living the brand in the way they interact. You can't do that if you have a ton of churn in employees. It's just impossible to do. And so it becomes central to you having that consistency and that spirit of how you're going to connect with your consumer to have happy employees that feel good and stay with you for a long period of time. So it's interconnected with frankly with relationship trust, maybe most directly. And for us, obviously, relationship trust is a very big deal. So that's what I would say is, it's completely interconnected with having, the kinds of scores that we have.
Mm-hmm. Sandra?
Absolutely critical for us, our front line. That's the face of the brand, right? I've always believed the store is the fullest expression of a brand, and that front line is how customers think of us. Yes, we do great, campaigns, or we'll take other actions, but a customer's experience in the store with our front line is the most important. And so we really work hard to engage them in our decisions. We listen to them. There's so many examples, I've shared just a few today, where we get their feedback and we implement their feedback, which builds trust. And that is how we believe we need to go forward, is treating them with tremendous respect, and also they can give so much back to the organization as a result.
Interesting. Tom?
Yeah, this isn't a surprise. It's something that's well known at A&W too. So we do put a particular focus on it as well. And I think I think it's good. I think it's very encouraging that our Canadian community puts a high value on how employees are treated. So it's a positive movement. And we certainly, the kind of, when we get guest concerns or feedback, one of the ones that people feel most strongly about is when, if they see employees and they think that the employees are not being fairly treated or something like that. That's when you really hear it from your A&W guests, that they say they really take that kind of feedback seriously, and then of course then we can too.
Interesting. A related question from coming on the Q&A feed, looking at, and I'm interpreting a little bit, looking at broader issues of competence and what your key expertise is as an organization. In some cases, you're being pulled into areas that are a little bit outside your core competencies. To what extent do you work with partners, particularly nonprofits, who maybe have more experience or are better aligned in terms of the mission to play a larger role in dealing with social issues? Is that part of your strategy, or do you try to bring it or keep it in-house? Jeff?
Yeah, it's a combination for us. We've been pretty active in issues that are related to road and driver safety, basically for 110 years. So that's always been a core competency in terms of the social, if you will, that domain. I think what we would say we do is we like to be what I call an honest broker in the way that we tackle issues. So I'll give you one example. So for years and years, there is this tense relationship between cyclists and drivers. It's been forever. And we really felt like the place for us there was to figure out how we can bring together stakeholders on all sides of these dialogues. Where does pedestrians, drivers, and cyclists lie? And so in that domain, we bring our knowledge and expertise on driver safety to the table, but we try and create forums where these folks can converse and interact, because they don't historically. And so it's really case by case, but we try and bring the expertise from the areas we know. And when we can bring groups together that know other areas that are in adjacent areas that are still in the wheelhouse of things that matter to us, that's the best way.
Okay, interesting. Sandra, is partnering with nonprofits part of how you both support them and gain more traction for your activities?
Absolutely. Our company mission and purpose is we are a family nurturing family. So we kind of use that as a lens by which we determine the most appropriate partnerships. Some of the ones that we have, for example, Special Olympics is one that's really important to us. We have very strong relationships with many of the food banks across Canada. And as I mentioned earlier, with our Community Action Fund, we empower the stores to engage with those partners so that we can add the most value. We want to give them what they need, and also they teach us a lot about what is needed in communities as well. So it's a two-way relationship where we're learning from them and in turn giving them what's most needed.
Okay. Any examples in that you'd want to share, Tom?
Yeah, I think that this kind of partnership it's important to treat it as a long-term partnership. You don't want to just be in it for a few years because you think it's going to be good and then stop doing it. So A&W's long-term partnership in this area that springs to mind for me is with the MS Society of Canada. And over the years, that's become stronger and stronger, and we rely on each other, and you become friends as partners as well. And you get to understand each other and more, and you get to meet more and more people that live with MS and understand it, and more people at A&W understand that, and you can start to share that with your guests. So that would be an example for me, and it's important that I truly believe it's important to have those go into those thinking this is going to be for the long term.
Okay, Jeff?
For us, we are very close to the food banks that are in our communities, and that's an area that we are certainly through the pandemic and beforehand close to. So one thing we've been doing is we have a deferred rewards program where we give members benefits in this thing called CA dollars, and what we've been doing is different clubs have been doing things like matching CA dollar donations to local food banks, and so that's an area that we believe in and we're going to stay close to over time, is working with those kinds of stakeholders. In addition to the kinds of things I talked about, which is more in the domain of areas that we've historically been, like the road and driver safety, and working with cycling organizations and other organizations that are connected to transportation.
Okay, thanks. Here's another question coming in, again, connecting to the Black Lives Matter movement, but suggesting that many organizations view trust as something we earn from customers, but beyond trust, some brands are thinking about concepts of dignity, treating customers with respect and equality, and demonstrating how the brands really value the being of their customers and help them achieve dignity as people. To what extent is the Black Lives Matter movement getting you to rethink that the nature of that customer interaction? Who wants to start on that? Sandra?
Yeah, I can start with that. I mean, certainly the events that have affected Black communities, both within North America and across the globe, it's really led us all to pause and take stock and take action. For us at Sobeys, diversity and inclusion has been a strategic priority within our company for a very long time. But now, on reflection, we recognize that we need to do more. Over the last 2 weeks, we've been listening, we've been learning, we've been educating ourselves even more fully to understand how we, as a proud Canadian brand, can evolve to support the needs of the Black community and other marginalized groups as well in real tangible ways. And we've taken a few initial steps, starting with conversation, more taking an inside-out approach. We're starting inside. Launching toolkits to help people managers, because what we've heard through the dialogue so far is sometimes they don't know what to say. It's not that they don't care, they don't know what to say. So we've given them a toolkit for that. We're continuing to have a series of open dialogue to inform them of our action plans. So we're launching an inclusive management program for all people leaders as part of a broader strategy. And we're also providing targeted education and awareness. We want to ensure that we're systematically reviewing all of our people practices to address any barriers to hiring, to career development, to performance. So overall, we're very much committed to working together to take action that's going to make a difference, because it truly is part of who we are as an organization.
Great. Jeff? What about you?
Yeah, for us, I mean, it's really, what we feel like what we need to do is a really solid kind of gap analysis of if and where we might be missing pieces. And it's a little bit like the third part of what Sandra was alluding to, which is that, you know, you need to really unpack and sit down with your HR people or other people in your organization and say, you know, we don't think that we're creating impediments, but maybe we are. And do we need to bring in outside experts to evaluate our processes and to make sure that we're meeting that? So I guess what I would say is we don't think of ourselves as having something that we see as right off the bat as being an impediment. But we also know we need third-party expertise to kind of evaluate it for us, is what I would say. And that's where we're going to go. Yeah.
Okay. But you both talked about a lot about the HR processes and what's happening on the employee side. Tom, what about in terms of interaction with customers? How do we make sure that, you know, the retail environment in particular is free from the kind of systemic bias or systemic racism that occurs? And, you know, Sandra alluded to an issue that had happened in the US a while ago. How do you prevent a store manager from calling the police to remove a customer just because of the color of their skin?
Well, I think it's got to start at the top of your organization, and I think education is a key part. You've got to bake it into your values that this is what we stand for, and we treat everybody equally. I mean, I really like the question, and I think that there's just listening and hearing some of the language people use, dignity, treating people with dignity, and that's totally what you should expect, whoever you are, whichever kind of establishment you walk into. So yes, I totally agree with the point, and I think that the whole Black Lives Matter movement has opened everybody's eyes even wider to it. So I think it's a good thing, particularly for the service industry, that I think this is going to change the service industry quite a lot. It's making A&W commit to even more changes, and it's really opened our eyes wider. But, you know, can you imagine having the police called on you in an establishment, and how bad and how humiliating and just how depressing that would make you feel? And I think that that's what we all need to have, is just more empathy for each other and treat each other with dignity. So and just listening to those kinds of questions and those comments is a really good thing for us all to be doing.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, did you have another comment on that?
Just very quickly, I wanted to say that, you know, for us, I think for us in Canada, it's certainly about the Black community, but I think it's about the Indigenous community as well. I think that's a big part of this. And then new Canadians. You know, there's so many more new Canadians in Canada that you see than in other jurisdictions. What are we doing from our interactions with folks? What are we doing in terms of hiring? Sometimes folks who come to Canada are brilliant people, but maybe their language skills aren't what they, you know, what we wish they could be, or they wish they could be, and somehow they're dismissed from doing certain roles, or maybe, you know, and that's a big part of what I want to look at in our organization, are those dimensions as well.
Okay, so let me put one final question to you, as we are unfortunately running out of time. This is fascinating, but it picks up another change in the environment, really around the ability of others to control the information about your brands. Certainly with social media, individuals have a lot of power to affect your brands and could undermine trust for whatever reasons they want. How do you manage social media in terms of looking at trust? And it's something that, you know, we're looking at as well, that even since we released our brand trust results on Monday, there has, at least for one of the brands, been a bit of a Twitter storm of people really criticizing both the study and the brand, and saying, you know, we don't believe this, casting all kinds of aspersions. How do you manage that dimension when you're trying to build trust in your brand and people maybe trying to undermine it? And think of that as maybe a closing comment as well. Sandra, do you want to go first on that?
I'm assuming you're talking about Facebook. I mean, there's been a lot said about Facebook.
Social media in general.
In general, okay. Well, in that particular case, I think there's a lot of discontent and distrust because of a hands-off approach. You know, as a marketer, I see brands to be like people, right? To trust someone, you need to know who they are, and you expect a certain level of consistency in their behavior. And when people are inconsistent, it breeds distrust. So I think in the case of social media and in the case of Facebook, their mission to build community and to bring the world closer together is inconsistent with their actions. And I think that is what has caused the distrust. So certainly from a marketing perspective, it's something that we're taking notice of. We're thinking about it and trying to determine you know, what that means for us as a brand to be on their platform.
Interesting. Jeff, what about you? How do you, what's your policy around engaging with social media and the discussions that happen there?
Hit it straight on, Saul. We get out there, interact with those people, find those people when they're saying things about our brand and engage them in discussion. You know, a lot of times the people that are doing that have been complaining through other channels beforehand and not getting any response. And so, first of all, we try and use our existing tools to talk to those people, but when they're out in social media, if they're saying something about our service or something, we try and hit it head on and, you know, literally start chatting with them and engaging them and hopefully converse with them to help, you know, at least understand what it is they're saying, and B, if we can, try and resolve whatever that they're unhappy about.
Interesting. Tom, I'll give you the last word on the panel.
Well, I like the advice of Jeff and Sandra. I think do engage. It's not always comfortable, but do engage. But also stick true to who you are. You know, that's what I think will help you in terms of your transparency and your long-term relationships. Yes, be consistent, stick true to who you are. Don't just suddenly change everything because of one comment, but do engage. It's not easy. It's I do appreciate the question. It's not easy.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And thank you all. I mean, this has been a really fascinating discussion. I appreciate you sharing your perspectives, and thanks to the audience as well. Let me just close with a final slide or two slides on my side, and a way to bring some of the discussion back together. And what we as a business school are suggesting is going on here is that there is an evolution taking place in the market, that we've moved already from a already product-based economy with functional delivery and functional characteristics. We're really driving consumer choice. Over time, as it became more difficult to differentiate oneself on product-based features, we saw the evolution towards a service-based economy, where relationships became much more important. Over time, what we're suggesting is that it'll become as difficult to differentiate your brand on the basis of your relationships or the quality of your service. And that we're moving to really a higher order concept, the idea that we differentiate ourselves based on our values. It's harder for anybody else to copy our values. They're most long-lived, they're deeply embedded, and also the basis for sustainability. So we think there's an evolution here. We don't think that consumers are trading off, and they're not going to say, well, because we like your values, we'll accept poorer product quality. But there is an evolution that we hope that you'll think about, and that this the session has stimulated your interest. If you would like more information, here's a get in touch screen. Please contact us. We'd love to engage you in a dialogue. For any of the brands out there, one of the things that we offer to any of the brand that we have data on, we'll provide a customized deck to you, looking at your particular brand over time and relative to your competitors. There's no charge for that. We see that as part of how we'd like to engage you. So please join with us in that engagement. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panelists. And then last word back to Lucy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Saul, Jeff, Sandra, and Tom for those amazing insights. In fact, the survey was, or the trust survey was made public yesterday, and I've learned that there's been significant media pickup, and in fact, CTV News has been reporting on it as well. So thank you for everyone for tuning in to this virtual exclusive experience today. And a very big thank you going out to our presenting sponsor, CAA, and for the support from the Gustavson School of Business at the University of Victoria as well. Before we sign off, I just wanted to remind you of a couple of our upcoming events at the CMA. June 25th, we have a CMA Cafe office hours happening. That's for members only. July 3rd, we have a Marketing Connected Live hosted by our CEO, John Wilshire, along with Brady Hamilton and Kim Coster, so tune into that. July 7th, we have our MarTech virtual morning event. The 20th is the final deadline for CMA award entries, so please do not forget to enter the awards. We have a ton of judges who have signed up to the awards, the most we've ever had. I think 404 judges have signed up, so lots of activity there. And then on August 6th, we have the CMA CX virtual morning event. And of course, you can find more details at cmacalendar.ca. Again, you will receive the recording of this event along with the survey. And if you want to stay connected with the marketing community during this time, please visit Marketing Connected on our homepage. And there's a lot of thought leadership articles there, resources, information on government supports for employees and businesses. So again, you will receive the recording, and any questions that were not responded to, we will get back to you for sure. So thank you again for tuning in. Stay safe and take care, everyone.